Locked beneath 100 feet of cold Lake Ontario darkness lies a time capsule of history. So sit back, relax, and join me as we descend beneath the waves and travel back in time to explore the wreck of the R.H. Ray. The Great Lakes, the world's largest inland waterways. From the mouth of the St. Lawrence River to Duluth, Minnesota, ships are able to travel over 3,000 kilometers into the heart of North America. Over the past 500 years, thousands upon thousands of ships have plied these waters. From the era of wind and sail to today's massive Great Lake carriers, the lakes have always been used as an efficient means of transport. But sadly, the lakes harbor a dark side. Wide, deep, and cold, they forever seek to claim both sailors and ships who dare to venture upon them. Each year, the list of lost ships grows longer and longer, and since the first vessel was lost, we have always been drawn to find their final resting places. For most of us in this auditorium, that desire to explore is what led us into scuba diving. So, let me ask a question. What makes for a great wreck dive? Looking back over my years of diving, I can think of several answers. How about being the first diver on a wreck? In 1995, with Spencer Schonecker aboard the Brooke Lauren, we had the privilege to be the first divers on the wreck of the Frontenac. Heading out for a dive, Spencer had a promising hit on his depth sounder, so we planned to do a quick bounce and see what it was. As we neared the bottom, out of the darkness appeared a wooden, steam-powered tugboat. The wreck was not hard to identify since you could still read its name across the stern. Sunk in 1929, it was in excellent condition, including its compass and wheel. It is hard to imagine that you could ever have a better dive. But wait, how about diving a fully intact wreck? In 2003, we were part of Joyce Hayward's team that did the site survey on the wreck of the Windy 8 for the NOAA Shipwreck Preserve in Alpena, Michigan. The wreck of the Windy 8 is so intact it seems wrong to use the word wreck in the same sentence. Having been frozen in pack ice, she descended so slowly to the bottom that even the wooden hatch covers did not float off. Again, it is hard to imagine a better dive. But what about a wreck with a wheel, anchor, or bowsprit? For many of us, a wreck is not complete if it does not have a wheel. And if one wheel is good, then having three is truly outstanding. Dave is one of the few divers that has the pleasure to dive the wreck of the Gunilda in Lake Superior. With its gold-trimmed bowsprit, anchors, and three wheels, it has to be one of the world's best shipwrecks. In 1911, the Gunilda grounded on a rock shoal and then later sunk during the foiled attempt to pull her clear. Today she sits in about 300 feet of ice-cold water, which has served to preserve her many artifacts. But let's face it, how often do you get to see a gold-trimmed bowsprit, or be the first diver to touch a wreck, or be part of a NOAA site survey? For most of us, a great dive is all about the mystery and history. That same explorer spirit that drew us to scuba diving in the first place keeps asking questions. During our first dive on the Ray back in 1998, I can remember asking, what type of ship is it? How did it sink? Who found it? Who has dove it? And did anybody die on it? For explorers, these type of questions always float through our minds as we float through the silence of the deep. And in finding these answers, even a simple wreck becomes a truly great dive. So let's answer those questions and satisfy the explorer spirit in all of us, and in doing so, I hope to show you what a great dive the R.H. Ray is.
We start our story of the R.H. Ray in 1960 in the county of Prince Edward, Ontario. A young woman named Barb Carson, having grown up with shipwreck stories of the region, was gripped with the desire to explore. When her cousin Lloyd Shale started to sell some of the first scuba gear in the area, Barb jumped in, literally with both feet, and trained herself to dive. Over the next 3 years, she dove several wrecks and started researching the records of Kingston in hopes of finding a wreck herself. In the spring of 1963, she was one of the first to get certified from the YMCA, and in those early years, she and many of the others in the class had more experience than their instructor. A month later, Barbara would find her first wreck. From that point on, she played an instrumental role in the finding of a large number of wrecks in the Kingston area. let's have a quick look at some of the wrecks she helped find. In 1963, Barb Carson and Lloyd Shale were involved in the finding of the city Shipwreck. Barb did most of the research work to locate the general area of the wreck southwest of Amherst Island. The research led to a quick find of the schooner. The 135-foot three-masted schooner City of Shipwreck was launched July 5, 1871 in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. After a 45-year career, the Sheboygan would make its last trip on September 25, 1915. A storm claimed the captain and crew of 4. Like many wrecks found in the 60s, many artifacts were removed from the Sheboygan. Today these are on display in area museums, with the wheel on display at the museum in Point Traverse. Today the wreck lies in a depth of 100 feet and still has many features for the divers to see, including a glass prism for letting light into the cabin below deck. Another unique item to see on the City of Sheboygan is the visible registration numbers on the hold opening. July 1963 saw the finding of the William Jameson by Lloyd Shales, Barb Carson, Ron Hughes, and John Birtwistle. The 100-foot schooner was launched in 1878 from Mill Point, Ontario. On Tuesday, May 15, 1923, during a spring storm, the 45-year-old William Jameson was leaking badly, and the crew made it to land safely after beaching the schooner on the north shore of Amherst Island. Sadly, the anchors did not hold, and the abandoned schooner drifted out and sank. Today the wreck lies at a depth of 80 feet. The 173-foot schooner barge Aloha was found by Lloyd Shale and Barb Carson in August of 1964. The ship and captain were lost in an October storm in 1917 off 9 Mile Point, while the rest of the crew survived. The wreck today lies at a depth of 50 feet. In 1993, Preserve Our Wrecks Kingston sang the FMA next to her to enhance the site for divers. The George A. Marsh is one of the most popular and fatal wrecks in the Kingston area. It was found October 7, 1967 by Barb Carson, Edward Donnelly, and Ted Simmons. The 135-foot three-masted schooner was built in 1882 in Mesquite, Michigan. 35 years later, on August 8, 1917, in a summer storm, the George A. Marsh was lost with her cargo of coal and 11 of the 14 crew, including the captain's wife and 5 children. The Marsh has one of the most interesting stories, that the supposedly lost captain of the Marsh turning up alive in Oklahoma 10 years after the sinking. Today the Marsh lies in 85 feet of water and is largely intact, with many artifacts such as the wheel, stove, and yawl boat still on the wreck. The Marsh is very photogenic, being intact and having an impressive bowsprit. While not one of the deepest wrecks in the Kingston area, the Marsh has claimed more divers' lives than any other wreck in that area. The 108-foot two-masted schooner Annie Faulkner was located in 1975 by Barb Carson with Audrey Rushbourne, Doug Pentingale. The Annie was launched in Kingston on May 22, 1867, 5 weeks before Canada became a country. November 12, 1904, in a violent storm, the Annie Faulkner and her cargo of coal were lost off South Bay Point. The crew made it to Amherst Island in the yawl boat. However, the first mate died of exposure after wandering away from the rest of the crew. Today, the wreck lies upright at a depth of 80 feet, with many of her artifacts to be seen, including the ship's wheel. The ship was well documented in 1982 by Preserve Our Wrecks Kingston. Some of the other wrecks Barb was involved in finding include the Katie Eccles in 1985 and the bow section of the Manola in 1976. But back to the story of the R.H. Ray. August 18, 1976, Barb along with her friend and fellow explorer Audrey Rushburn, were searching for the wreck of the Burt Barnes. The Burt Barnes may look familiar to some of you in the audience. It's the official flagship logo of Save Ontario Shipwrecks, or SOS. Searching in that era was very difficult, as there was no side-scan sonar, GPS, or even Loran-C. They would search their target area by running grids using landmarks, line of sight, and boat wakes. You can imagine their excitement when they got a spike on the paper readout out of their depth sounder, which was only able to see directly below the boat. They geared up and dove down to find an intact schooner. The wreck appeared to match the Burt Barnes and was clearly of historic significance. Little did they know it would take more than 10 years before the wreck's true identity would be found. After the dive, Audrey used her sextant to note the latitude and longitude, and Barb fixed the location with landmarks. That day, they decided to keep the location of the wreck a secret in order to protect it. Barb and Audrey were both instrumental in the founding of the Maritime Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston, so they applied for and received the salvage rights from the Canadian government. This allowed them to remove artifacts from the wreck with the purpose of putting them on display at the museum. Plans were made for photographing and documenting the wreck. Unfortunately, Audrey became ill and passed away the following year, so the work of documenting the wreck was put on hold. The Ray story continues in 1980 when Barbara learned that famed underwater explorer Jacques Cousteau had planned a visit to the Great Lakes with his converted World War II minesweeper, the Calypso. The main purpose of the visit was to explore the famous 1812 wrecks of the Hamilton and the Scourge and create a movie for the National Film Board of Canada. Barb, still thinking the wreck was the Burt Barnes, made an offer to Cousteau via the Kingston Marine Museum to explore the virtually untouched shipwreck believed to have been built in the 1880s. Barb received the answer she had hoped for, and Cousteau would visit the shipwreck. She was hoping to get access to the footage and photographs that would be taken in order to help her with the research on the wreck. Early on Wednesday, September 3rd, 1980, Barb Carson and Doug Pettingale met the Calypso and led the ship out to the wreck of the Barnes, which they had marked the previous day. After the Calypso dropped anchor, Barb and Doug tied off to the Calypso and were welcomed aboard. They watched as the helicopter headed out to take some aerial photographs of the Thousand Islands and Kingston area, while the dive crew aboard the Calypso suited up and got ready for their first dive on the wreck. That morning, 4 divers left the Calypso and boarded a Zodiac to take them over to the dive site and the wreck below for their first morning dive. After a while, some of the divers returned to the surface and the boat went into a commotion. But with everybody speaking French, Barb and Doug did not understand at first what was going on. The Canadian Film Board representative came over and explained one of the divers was missing. The divers returned to the water to look for their missing diver, but only having a short bottom time, they were not able to find him. At 11 a.m. the call went out from the Calypso that they had a missing diver, and a search and rescue team from Trenton responded, with 3 divers being sent by helicopter. Around 2:45 in the afternoon, the body of 30-year-old André Galineau from Marseille, France, was found on the wreck and returned to the Calypso. Barb, who was trying to keep the wreck a secret while she continued to do her research, now found the existence of the wreck in all the local newspapers. The Calypso returned to the wreck a week later and completed some more dives with Barb on board. The divers on those next dives were able to remove many artifacts from the wreck, including items of pottery, lights, crocks, deadeye, as well as the ship's wheel. Barb had all the Calypso crew sign a generic site plan that was being used to show the divers the general layout of a schooner, and on which the divers, upon their return, marked the locations of artifacts they had removed. It would later be displayed at the museum in Kingston. Although Jacques Cousteau was not on the ship during any of the dives done on the Ray, his wife was on board and also signed the plan. The items were taken to the university for preservation and conservation work. They would be displayed at the Kingston Museum after the preservation was complete. number of weeks later, the Calypso crew returned to Kingston from the Montreal area to see the work being done on the artifacts and to take additional footage for the movie. When the final film was made for the Canadian Film Board, there was no mention of the barns or the diver lost on that trip. Barbara never did receive any of the footage or photographs taken on those dives. Many years later, a diver out with George and Suzanne of Duck's Dive Charters in Picton found the knife and dive tables believed to have been from the lost diver. The period of the items and the fact that the dive tables were in French support this belief.
In this same period, Barbara became close friends with Rick Nielsen, who also loved to explore for shipwrecks and was very gifted in doing research. The work done on the wheel by the university uncovered patent markings. With much effort, Rick was able to track those down. That information, combined with other facts, led Barbara and Rick to the conclusion that the wreck was not the Bart Burns. In the end, it still took them another 5 years of research to finally identify the wreck as the R.H. Ray. The Ray was built for the Ray Brothers and Company of Hamilton and was launched on October 5, 1857. Built in the Port Dalhousie shipyard of Donaldson and Andrews of St. Catharines, she was to be the flagship of the Ray Brothers shipping fleet. The local St. Catharines Journal describes her as follows: "One of the most beautiful and, as nautical men assure us, most seaworthy barks ever set afloat from the Port Dalhousie shipyard. As a piece of naval architecture, she is pronounced second to none on the lakes, either for beauty, durability, or speed, and we have been informed she will pass at number 1 with a star. Her length of keel is 135 feet, breadth of beam 26 feet, and depth of hold 11 foot 6 inches. Barb and Audrey had at first identified the wreck as a schooner, but the Ray was actually a bark. The difference between them is how the sails are rigged. Schooners had anywhere from 2 to 7 masts, all rigged fore and aft, with the sails running in line with the center of the ship. They required a smaller crew and could point higher into the wind, thus were more maneuverable. Barks had at least 3 masts, which all but the rearmost masts square rigged. Vessels rigged this way would take better advantage of the prevailing winds and were used for long ocean passages. The Ray was built for the transatlantic trade, but it is unclear if she ever made it out of the Great Lakes. A couple weeks after her launch, she made her first and only run of the 1857 season. The trip was to Chicago and back under the command of Captain Beaumont, but this maiden voyage did not go well. On leaving Port Burwell, Ontario, she grounded and jettisoned her deck load of lumber. After wintering in Hamilton, her first trip of the 1858 season was to Chicago, where she picked up a load of wheat and delivered it to Kingston, Ontario. The trip from Chicago to Kingston took 16 days, 7 of which was the transit of the Welland Canal. Following that, we have not found any records of her voyages for the next 3 months. 2 p.m., August 3rd, 1858, is the next chapter in the story of the Ray. Carrying a cargo of wheat just 40 miles east of Kingston, she was hit by a white squall and sunk. Everyone on board was picked up by the Peller colonist. 3 days later, the Kingston Daily News is quoted as follows: "News was brought by the crew of the bark R.H. Ray that she was struck with a squall about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, capsized and sunk, going down so gradually as to enable Captain Beaumont, his wife, another female, and all hands to escape in the small boat. This occurred in the neighborhood of the Ducks, island so called in Lake Ontario. They saved nothing from the vessel and arrived here in the boat, utterly destitute, wet, and hungry. The following summer, Mr. Quinley from Detroit made an attempt to raise the Ray. A second attempt was made 8 years later by the Boston Marine Company. While both attempts were unsuccessful, many items like the anchors and masts were most likely removed. Many websites and books have listed that she was named after the famous Arctic navigator of the time. This is incorrect. She was named after Richard Honeyman Ray, born in 1911, one of 6 Ray brothers. John Ray, who in 1853 discovered on one of his Arctic trips the location of the ill-fated Franklin expedition, was born in 1913 and was Richard's younger brother. Research on the Ray can be difficult since a schooner named John Ray also sunk off the docks in 1866. It was originally built as the John Heisman, and then in 1856 to John Ray. The wreck was recovered a year later and renamed again to Duncan City. Part of the Ray's mystery is that she was built state-of-the-art for her time and no expense was spared in her design. Even so, she sunk less than a year after she was launched. An example of this is that she was the first Canadian vessel to have Cunningham's patented self-reefing topsails. These enabled the crew to quickly furl or unfurl the topsails from the deck, thus eliminating the dangers of climbing high into the rigging on a moving ship. Another piece of cutting-edge design was the patented steering gear made by E.B. Robinson of Boston. Attached to the rudder stock, a series of screws made the work of steering easier and steadier. This was also a key item in finally identifying the wreck. In addition, 2 strong iron bars were placed abaft of each mast, down through to the keelson. This was done instead of placing the masts at either end of the centerboard box. Movement of the mast quite often caused leaks in the centerboard box, and this new design would eliminate that. Other improvements included a stronger deck design, improved windlass, and double bulkheads in case of collision. But as every Great Lakes sailor knows, no ship is strong enough when the Spirit of the Lakes throws forth her full fury. So now that you have learned the mystery and history of the R.H. Ray, who here is looking forward to logging a dive on this great wreck? The final chapter of our story today is a group of divers doing just that. This past summer, members of the Niagara Divers Association did a weekend charter to the Ducks, and on the afternoon of August 3rd at 2 o'clock, they found a way to make a great wreck dive even better. How many divers get to make a Sesquicentennial dive? Yes, it was exactly 150 years to the hour that the Ray slipped beneath the waves and into history. As the club explored the wreck that day, there was no golden bowsprit, no upright masts, and no wheel. But all of them will remember it as a great dive, since it was filled with mystery and history. 150 years of mystery and history.